Good morning and welcome. This is the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on Resources and Transportation. Would note that we are a 5-member committee. Obviously, there's only one of us here. We cannot take official action on any item until we have a quorum. We'll need 2 more members to achieve that. We can, however, in the interest of folks who are here, start and do some of this work that is on our agenda today that is more of a presentation, more for information, and then we will specifically deal with the items that require a vote once we get a quorum. So with that, we'll note for the record that Chair Rich Gordon is here, and we'll add the other members to the roll call when they arrive. So today we're going to be taking a look at Caltrans and the Department of Motor Vehicles. We'll be asking each department to give us a general overview of their budget. We will identify some BCPs. For those of you who are not familiar with capital jargon, that's a budget change proposal. We'll review those for both departments. And there are a couple of specific issues in each department that we're going to take a look at. In Caltrans, we'll be talking about the project initiation documents and the mass transportation program. And with the Department of Motor Vehicles, we'll be discussing the proposal for a registration discount. And we'll also be discussing proposals relative to their technology infrastructure and process improvement. So with that, let's get underway, and let me invite the Caltrans to come forward. Malcolm, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. And I'm going to ask if you would kind of begin and give us kind of an overview of your budget and issues that you're facing. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also have with me Norma Ortega, our Chief Financial Officer. Just as a quick overview, as requested, a brief department overview as well as a summary of the workforce cap actions that have been taken by the department recently. Caltrans' mission, of course, is to improve mobility across California. This is accomplished through constructing, operating, and maintaining a comprehensive statewide system of over 50,000 lane miles of highways and freeways, and providing intercity passenger rail service under contract with Amtrak throughout California. Caltrans also has responsibility for airport safety, input into land use decisions, and other planning activities. Our legal authority is found in the Streets and Highway Code, Section 90, and Government Code, Section 14000. The 2012-2013 governor's budget proposes $11.2 billion in expenditures and 21,307 positions. This level of resources represents a $2.2 billion reduction from the enacted 11-12 budget, and as noted in your agenda, the reduction is primarily related to the absence of new Proposition 1B funds that were not appropriated in the governor's budget. The Caltrans proposed position level of 21,307 is a reduction of 1,950 positions over the last 5 years. Caltrans currently has 1,042 vacancies, which is less than 5% of the total positions. In 2010-2011, the department implemented the workforce cap by reducing 5% of the PYs and $90 million in corresponding personal service dollars. In order to comply with the full implementation of the administration's workforce cap reduction, the department eliminated 1,140 positions. 817 positions were in the capital outlay support and planning programs in the current year, and 323 positions will be through a 2012-2013 BCP. Caltrans' budget is divided into 6 primary programs: aeronautics, highway transportation, mass transportation, transportation planning, administration, and equipment. About 1/3, 35% of Caltrans' budget is federally funded. Another 1/3, 33%, is from the state highway account, and the remainder is comprised of bonds, 16%, reimbursement authority, 14%, and a very small level of PTA resources, about 2%. And that concludes my department overview, as well as information on how we address the workforce cap, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
I do have one question. I know that you've said that overall there has been reduction in staffing, but I'm looking at our staff report. It's a page 1 where there's kind of a summary of your budget, and it shows here as you described, that there's a $4 billion budget reduction, $4 billion less than last year. But it also shows 165 additional positions. So I was just trying to understand, in looking at that chart, what was happening with position growth and how that related. Also a little curious how you grow positions when you're losing $4 billion. But
well, and the largest part of the change is because Prop 1B wasn't included in the budget. So presumably resources for Proposition 1B will come subsequent. The position reduction that I highlighted was over the past 5 years.
Right.
And we could break that down for you so you could see the difference between the positions over 5 years.
Okay. And then the increase that's proposed for the coming year, the 165 positions over last year. Can you give me some sense of where those would be located and what
the majority of those positions are a continuation of limited terms. So in the budget, it would show that those positions would end. We're extending them for a few more years. It's primarily work related to local assistance, some mass transportation, some bond work. We received limited term Prop 1B administrative resources, and so we are requesting to extend that. Though we did have a high of several, I think it was like 79 positions, we're bringing the Prop 1B workload down.
Okay.
But we are continuing it for 2 more years.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the information because sometimes we're just not clear about the number looks one way, but and I know there's an explanation. I'm just trying to get to it. So thank you. Yeah. In terms of the overview, I appreciate that. We're and I think what we wanted to do is to take a look at and have a brief conversation about the budget change proposals. I'm going to we need one more person to take a vote on those when we get to it. But the so let me ask Christian, do you want to identify the budget change proposals that you want us to consider today, so we get those in the record?
Christian Griffith with the Assembly Budget Committee. Just the agenda, for purposes of rolling up a number of different items that seemed non-controversial and which there didn't seem to be any concerns, the agenda identifies three areas where there are BCPs, the federalization of pavement preservation and bridge inspection funds. This is on page 6 of the agenda. Construction oversight of federal projects and continuation of temporary positions cited earlier, and the BCP numbers, which are technical, are actually in parentheses at the end. In addition, the agenda also notes some statutory language that has been requested in the budget for technical changes to the fuel tax swap, and the agenda recommends adoption of those statutory changes in placeholder format, which then allows that to be conceptually adopted. But as Ledge Council looks at the language, there might be some technical changes that need to be made.
All right, and let me note that we do have a quorum, and that we've been joined by Assembly Member Butler and Assembly Member Huffman. And Mr. Huffman, we're about ready to take a vote, if I can get a motion. Well, let me explain that. Actually, we'll do an official roll call first.
Mr. Gordon?
Here.
Ms. Butler? Here. Mr. Huffman? Here. Mr. Jones and Mr. Valadeo?
And Mr. Jones and Mr. Valadeo are not expected today. So what I'm looking for is related to the staff recommendation on page 7, and it would be to adopt the placeholder statutory language, which relates to the fuel tax swap. This is technical in nature and allows us to complete the fuel tax swap. And secondly, the budget change proposals, that includes a budget change proposal number 12, which is identified on page 4, that has to do with the workforce cap, and budget change proposals that are identified on page 6, relating to the federalization of pavement preservation and bridge inspection funds, construction oversight of federal projects, and the continuation of temporary positions. If placeholder language and those budget change proposals are acceptable, we need a motion in the affirmative for that. Okay. And we have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Mr. Gordon?
Aye.
Ms. Butler? Aye. Mr. Huffman? Jones Valadeo?
And that motion passes. We'll move to the second item on the agenda here. This is related to the project initiation documents, or PIDs, the project plan. Attention here will be to hear from Department of Finance, LAO, and the department. We'll take some public comment, if there is any, and then we'll give some consideration to this item. The staff does have a recommendation that we'll get to before we take a vote. So, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Once again, Malcolm Doherty, Caltrans Acting Director. Project initiation documents. I want to give a brief overview of that and then specifically talk about the request by the department. Project initiation documents, PID, PIDs, as I'll refer to them later in my testimony, is a report that documents the scope, cost, and schedule of a project. And just like for a business to justify funding for an upcoming project, it must define the business plan and identify the goals of that venture. Business plans assist in allocating resources properly, handling unforeseen complications, and making the right decisions from the outset. Similar to a business plan, the PID defines the project, alternatives, resource needs, schedule for programming and project development, assumptions, constraints, and risks in an effort to ensure that the right decisions are made at the outset of the project. It is the initiation phase of a project and essential to the success of project delivery throughout that process. Further, they document the transportation deficiency, the objectives of how we're going to overcome that deficiency, the existing conditions, the initial assumptions, stakeholder input, and a plan of action to deliver the project. And lastly, they assist in the preventing cost overruns and project delays, optimizing federal funding, and ensuring that only feasible projects move forward. The PID is much more than just a cost estimate. Caltrans is requesting 16 new positions and $2.2 million in state highway account and 51 positions and $8.4 million in reimbursement authority for reviewing, approving, and developing project initiation documents, or PIDs, in the transportation planning program. All projects on the state highway system, whether state or locally sponsored, require an approved PID before they can be programmed and proceed to the capital phase. With this increase to the base, the department will be able to leverage an estimated $11.95 billion in total projects. Project initiation documents are the mechanism for starting new projects. It feeds the project delivery process with the highest priority projects to repair, improve, and keep the state highway system safe. This year, we are on track to successfully deliver 279 projects valued at $3.2 billion to construction, and we're currently working on 700 projects out in construction valued at over $10 billion, and all those projects started with a project initiation document. At this point, I'll conclude my remarks and be more than happy to answer any questions.
Before we take questions, let me see if the Department of Finance would like to weigh in and make some comments on this.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark Tollefson, Department of Finance. And one of the things that's indicated in the staff report here is who pays for these, and that's one of the main questions. And the administration does not support the staff recommendation to convert all of these positions to state funding. I guess I'll give a little bit of background in terms of the administration's policy to require reimbursement for PID's workload for local measure projects on the state highway system. And really, there's two main reasons for this. The first is that these are local projects that address a local need, and essentially we feel that the local agency should pay for the development of those projects. Secondly, historically, local agencies had come in for these large requests for numbers of PIDs, regardless of kind of the timing of when those projects would actually be constructed, or regardless of the funding source. And I will acknowledge that Caltrans has worked very closely with local agencies to help reduce those requests to align more with realistic funding options. But at the same time, by allowing or giving a local agency kind of a skin in the game, it requires them to make a financial decision to determine if it really makes sense for them to work on this PID today versus potentially delaying it into the future to more align it with actual funding. And one of the things noted in the staff report is that in the current year there were 126 projects that were intended to move forward when these were going to be state-funded projects. Yet when they ended up being reimbursed funded, only 25 agencies came forward to put their own funds for these projects. So to me, that leads me to believe that some of these were potentially not priority projects or could be pushed out into future years. And of those projects, when we're talking about PIDs, a lot of times these aren't projects that are going to be delivered in the next year. These are future projects. So of the 126, really only about a fifth of those would actually be ready for construction in the next 2 years, whereas the others were all for future programming cycles, 15, 16, and beyond. So we feel that the reimbursement policy helps align these requests with the actual project needs.
All right, and let me give the LAO an opportunity to weigh in.
Sure. Anthony Symbol with the LAO. In our review of the governor's proposal, we identified 2 concerns that we wanted to call to your attention. The first one is that the governor's budget request appears not to assume the streamlined version of PIDs that the department recently developed for particular types of projects, depending upon the extent of the environmental review that would be need to be done in the future to have a better estimate and scope of the project. We think using these streamlined version PIDs would not only reduce some time spent on these PIDs, but as well as the number of resources needed to complete PIDs. And then our second concern that we've identified is, as was mentioned, these PIDs are developed and required prior to them being programmed within the transportation programs and before funding is allocated. And it appears that the number of projects that the governor's budget assumes, number of PIDs that assume that will be completed, appears to exceed the actual number of funding that will be available to fund the projects. In other words, we think it overestimates the need of the PIDs that will actually be needed. For these 2 concerns, we have 2 different recommendations. Our first recommendation is, given the concerns I talked about, we recommend not approving the governor's budget request at this time. Our second recommendation is, really, regardless of whatever level you decide to provide or whatever funding source you want to use to fund the governor's request, we'd recommend that you adopt language directing the department to use these streamlined PIDs, the ones I mentioned that they recently developed, as well as to have the department report back to you a year from now on how that process is going. So again, regardless of what level you decide to provide the department to do their PIDs, we think that you should have some information as well as direct them to use these streamlined version of PIDs.
Okay, thank you. Let me, I want to get all the kind of testimony out before we have a discussion here. So let me ask, I know we've asked some folks to give some testimony. Is Ross Chittenden and Keith Dunn, if they would come up and maybe a couple folks could give up places there for them temporarily? And following these presentations, we'll take additional public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Keith Dunn, Executive Director of Self-Help Counties Coalition, and appreciative of the opportunity to be before you today. We have had the opportunity to discuss PIDs for a number of years, and every time since 2009 first discussions were initiated, this committee has decided that the state should continue to invest in funding the oversight work at Caltrans. We're here to request that action be continued today. I'm going to let Ross, who's really the expert in PIDs, discuss in detail some of the work that's been done since then, but I'm going to just recap briefly the work that the self-help counties have done. As you know, the self-help counties are made up of 19 counties that have passed with a two-thirds vote of their citizens a half-cent sales tax to fund improvements in the transportation infrastructure. Many of those improvements enhance the state highway system. Those projects require PIDs, that's correct. But they enhance the system, and they're funded by us. We have all the skin in the game. We're the principal funder of infrastructure in the state of California today. The majority of the state's funding goes to maintenance. So the notion that we don't have skin in the game is absolutely false, and I want to put that to rest to start with. The second point that I'd like to make is that as we move forward and look at PIDs, we support the streamlining effort. The problem that we've come to is that the requirement to have the state be reimbursed initiates what we call a cooperative agreement with the department. Some of the delays in projects on delivery is because we've added 6 to 7 months at minimum at times to negotiate a cooperative agreement before we do the PID, which is the initial document. So the streamlining effort has been hijacked by, I think, this effort to cause a reimbursement by adding the cooperative agreement to the front of it. It's caused delayed, it's caused extra cost, and it hasn't worked. So with that, I'm going to give the rest of my time to Ross, who will speak more definitively about the process.
All right, great. Thank you, Keith, and thanks, Chair Gordon and committee and staff for giving me this opportunity to speak. Again, my name is Ross Chittenden. I'm the Chief Deputy Executive Director with the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, also known as CCTA. CCTA is one of the 19 self-help counties, counties where over two-thirds of the voters have passed a tax to finance transportation purposes. I would like to also mention, prior to my employment with CCTA, I spent 27 years with Caltrans. It's great to see my friends from Caltrans here, and I'd like to thank them for what they do in partnership with the Self-Help County Coalition. But I mentioned that in that many of those years, part of my role was to program state dollars. I worked in positions that made decisions over which projects would go into the STIP, which projects would go into the SHOP, and in Proposition 1B. So I just want to add that I think that allows me to understand the objectives of the department, but working with CCTA, I think I also understand and appreciate the needs of local agencies. My comments are really related to the reimbursement portion of the discussion. And much of what I want to say has already been said by Keith, but I'll try to amplify that a little bit. Again, as he said, we specifically believe that the PIDs required by Caltrans for local agencies are too complex, too onerous. And as Keith mentioned, efforts to streamline really did miss the mark. And then we strongly disagree with the positions of Caltrans and Department of Finance that we should be paying Caltrans for the oversight of those PIDs. Keith mentioned self-help counties invest hundreds of millions of dollars each year to improve the state highway system. These dollars augment state and federal funds, and in many cases really is the majority of the funding in an individual county where we mix and match the dollars, and for many projects is the only source of funding for those projects. And the thing I'd like the committee also to know is when we put a sales tax measure on the ballot, to get the voter support, we generally identify the projects in the ballot that we'll be working on. So that's a very big distinction between what the state does with PIDs to funnel money to projects where they get the money programmatically. When the voters approve the initiative, we know what projects we need to work on. What we really need is a streamlined path to get to the point where we can start working on those projects. So we don't need a full-blown PID to make that decision. That decision's already made for us from the voters. There are some inefficiencies in the way we work on PIDs. Much of the work that's in a PID gets repeated in the environmental phase. So we think that having the streamlined PID as suggested by LAO really will help us get to the point where we can do the detailed studies in environmental, working cooperatively with Caltrans. So there we think there's a redundancy that's just a waste of taxpayers' money. So what we're really looking for, again, is getting that feedback from Caltrans early on the projects on any fatal flaws or the critical items that we need to look at as we move into the project development phase. Another major distinction that I'd like you to consider when you talk about scope and the level of PIDs. PIDs were created in the early 1990s by the legislature and the California Transportation Commission. They wanted a level of documentation and a risk assessment before state funds were programmed. Again, as Keith said, these are local dollars, and we understand the risks. We know how to identify and manage risk. So we'd like to, again, to have the flexibility to have a more streamlined version, knowing local dollars and knowing that we understand risk and can assess that risk as we move forward with the projects. Related to the oversight itself, there's a couple of points. First, if you streamline the PID, you're reducing the cost of the oversight. That's just kind of a simple point there. Whoever pays for it, the cost is reduced. And then again, as Keith said, the requirement to reimburse Caltrans has created a new bureaucracy that slows down projects by many months, in some cases years, and adds tremendously to the cost of developing PIDs. And I think that's really the reason. We heard from the Department of Finance that there was 150-some PIDs, I think was the number that was identified to move forward, and only 25 of those have actually signed a reimbursement agreement. Much of that is just the cumbersome nature of negotiating and signing those agreements. So I don't think it's necessarily that they're not priority projects. The process that's been set up with Caltrans to put together a 3-year plan looking at PIDs to make sure that projects are in regional transportation plans, those are priority projects. They're just not moving forward either because of the process itself, or in some cases jurisdictions, rural areas, they just don't have the money to pay for the oversight. So I think it's really disingenuous to say that these are not priority projects. The other part of that, Keith mentioned about the capital funding and the skin in the game. For most PIDs, we're paying a consultant to do the PID work itself. So we're not asking you to fund that. We've accepted that as a cost. We're really asking that you provide the resources to Caltrans to give us the feedback we need to go forward. It's kind of interesting with that. Last year, as you know, the administration, governor vetoed a small amount of funding that was provided for this purpose. I think it was $8 million last year. And Keith and I met with folks from Caltrans and some folks from the Department of Finance. What we heard at that time was part of the reason for that was this is taking money away from the shop, the program that funds rehabilitation and restoration. And I understand that, being in the business long enough, that should be our priority. But what misses the mark there is that when we do our projects, we're often also rehabilitating and restoring the state highway system. If we do a widening, we're generally rehabilitating the adjacent lanes. If we modify an interchange, we're correcting operational deficiencies that are being paid for by local funds. So we think this is a very small investment that allows us, an investment by the state that allows us to put millions of dollars on the state highway system. We just want to get to the point where we can invest our dollars faster.
Thank you. Let me ask if there's anyone from the public who would like to comment on this issue. We'll ask you to come forward to one of the microphones and give you 2 minutes. Can we turn that microphone on? Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer Tannehill with Aaron Reed and Associates on behalf of PEG. Caltrans is the responsible agency for the state highway system, and since this is the state responsibility, the state should pay for it. So PEG supports the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, let me bring this back for the committee. And if you look at page 11 of our staff report, there's really 2 issues I think we've been presented with here. One has to do with the kind of the scope of the PIDs. The LAO has some comments in their remarks, and my suggestion would be that we would, I think, ask the administration, department, to work with stakeholders, continue to work on this. I'd like to suggest, and the LAO has, in their suggestion, suggested we might want to ask for a report back by May 1st of 2013. I'd like to get a report back by this May 1st, so that we can make some decision about whether we want to adopt budget trailer language on this matter, to see whether or not over the next couple of months, a month and a half, some additional stakeholder meetings could be held and to try to move towards some agreed upon simplification, streamlining of that process, and that way the committee could reconsider this at a future point. The second item has to do with the budget proposal for how these PIDs are paid for. And I'd point out that while Department of Finance suggests that the staff recommendation to have the state highway account pay for this is a conversion of cost, I'd actually point out that in the budget that the legislature adopted twice last year, we took the position that this is a state function and the state should pay. Governor vetoed that part of the legislature's budget. I, for one, continue to feel that this is a state function. I just, what in particular troubles me is that we've got only 19 of the 58 counties are self-help counties. And a self-help county does, have some local resources. But those counties that are not self-help, and many of them are rural, don't have that kind of support. And I worry tremendously about the kind of burden we put on those places. This has historically been a state function. I, for one, think that the staff recommendation to reject the governor's proposal and continue to suggest that this be a state function is probably appropriate, but looking for other comments.
I agree with you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a good direction. I hope we can do it quickly and make some progress this year. I like the idea of the new direction that these PIDs might be able to go in. Why simple projects without a lot of environmental impacts would have to wait in the same queue as complex projects that are going to take a long time to develop is something that we need to question, and maybe we have an opportunity to make it all work better for our local partners that are, I agree with you, trying to move important projects together all over the state. So I support that direction, and we'll second it if that's the request.
Yeah, so what I would suggest is we'll look for a motion that would say that on the issue of the scope of the PIDs that we'd like continued work and a report back by May 1st, and on the that we would reject the administration's proposal on the funding of the PIDs by local dollars, and rather say that this should continue to be funded with state highway count. So I have a motion, a second in that regard. Mr. Huffman moves. Ms. Butler seconds. Roll call, please.
Mr. Gordon.
Aye.
Ms. Butler. Aye. Mr. Huffman. Aye.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the final item now for the Department of Transportation, Caltrans, and that is the mass transportation program. Here we're looking at a budget change proposal relative to funding in this area, and the staff does recommend that we adopt the proposed budget change proposal, but we ought to perhaps have it described to us first before we consider that action.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members, committee members. Just briefly, Malcolm Doherty, Caltrans Acting Director. Once again, Mass Transportation Program at Caltrans includes two distinct divisions, the Mass Transportation Division as well as the Rail Division. This proposal requests a permanent reduction to these divisions of 58 positions and $5 million in the public transportation account. 14 of these positions will be redirected for 2 years to address continuing ARA, workload before being permanently reduced, and this reduction is part of the administration's overall effort to achieve efficiencies in state government.
Any comments from Department of Finance?
Matt Robinson with the Department of Finance. I would just say that we support the committee's recommendation.
Okay. And LAO?
Brian Weatherford, LAO. We recommend adopting the proposal, but we are concerned about the transition from the current organization to the proposed organization, and that in our discussions with Caltrans, they haven't they indicated they haven't developed a plan for that transition and to make sure that all the important functionalities are retained. And so we'd only additionally recommend that maybe we check back in a year to see how the zero-based budgeting is going.
Okay, thank you. Is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, the staff recommendation is to adopt the proposed budget change proposal, and I would suggest that we add to that with a request that next year there be, as part of the presentation on the Caltrans budget, we get some update on the status of this change. Please, questions, comments?
Just a quick clarification. If this is just streamlining at the state level to reflect the fading away of the ARA funds, that makes perfect sense. But will this have any impact on local transit operations?
Just for clarification, the proposal is a reduction in staff based on a reduction in PTA funding. We recognize that there's still ARA projects going on and still a need for ARA funding, or there's still ARA funding coming in the mass transportation and rail programs, and therefore we're recommending continuing all of the ARA funded positions in those two sections of the mass transportation program.
All right, local transportation,
local transportation oversight,
will not be affected by this.
No.
Okay, that's my question. Thanks.
Good
I'm happy
question.
to move the recommendation.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Gordon?
Aye.
Butler? Aye. Huffman?
Okay, that motion passes. Mr. Dockery, thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we'll invite the Department of Motor Vehicles to come forward.
Hey, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a long time.
All right. Good morning and welcome. What I'm going to request is that we start this with a kind of an overview and ask the Department of Motor Vehicles to talk with us a little bit about the proposed budget for next year and any specific special projects, activities, things you wanted to highlight for us. We'd appreciate hearing about that. And then we'll take up a couple of specific items. But, if you'd introduce yourself and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is George Valverde. I'm the Director of the Department of Motor Vehicles. I have with me today our Budget Officer, Robbie Crockett, and I also have here on my right an Executive Fellow, Guadalupe Manriquez. She's one of 24 Executive Fellows that are working in state government and getting a first-hand look of how an operation like the Department of Motor Vehicle works. So you might want to ask her some questions about her experience later. The mission of the department, is to serve the public by providing quality licensing and motor vehicle-related services. The department licenses 24 million drivers and registers over 30 million vehicles. We provide direct service to approximately 20 million customers on an annual basis through our field offices. This is accomplished through a network of 169 field offices and support services in 3 of our telephone services centers, as well as our headquarters staff. Over the last 5 years, the department has made a strong effort to implement best practices that will move our services to alternative delivery channels. These channels include the internet, telephone, mail, and our self-service terminals. Over the last year, we have installed 35 self-service terminals in various locations throughout the state. You may have had an opportunity to see one. They're in our offices primarily in Southern California, but we do have locations in the Bay Area and in Sacramento where we have installed self-service terminals. We also implemented 9 major IT projects, and we think because of the implementation of those projects, we have been able to serve our customers much more efficiently and much more effectively without a significant increase in staffing levels. The department maintains 9 major program areas and 5 offices. The department has an established Enterprise Governance Council. The council, which is made up of the 9 program representatives, is responsible for the department's strategic direction and initiatives for dealing with projects that impact the department, oversight of IT projects, as well as succession planning and privacy and security matters. We continue to use outreach measures to evaluate our performance areas for the department as it relates to services that we look at, serving our public. We also still monitor quality of service in the field office by doing surveys and tracking wait times. From a budgetary standpoint, the 2012-13 budget proposes $963.6 million, which is approximately a $50.8 million increase from 2011-12. These increases are attributed to about $6.3 million in various budget change proposals, reductions of $2.2 million in one-time and ongoing adjustments, and $46 million for pro rata and employee comp issues. In 2011-12, we estimated revenue collections of $8.2 billion, and these were in the areas of vehicle license fee, our vehicle vessel registration, our licensing program, and various other fees. Our administrative costs are about 11.2% of our total expenditures, and in terms of personnel, in 2012-13, our budget proposes 8,220 staff to fulfill our program requirements. Let's see, in terms of vacancies, we currently maintain approximately a 7% vacancy level. That's a brief overview of the department's budget. As far as the workforce cap plan, in 2010-11, the department was required to reduce about $24.5 million and 213 PYs, personnel years. We've achieved that over a 3-year period, and in 12-13, we will complete that workforce cap plan by reducing our budget by 22 positions and $1.9 million.
Great, thank you. Let me see if anyone has, I've got a couple questions, and we'll see if anyone else has questions. The $50 million increase in expenditure, can you give me some idea of, what that represents? I mean, most places we're going down, here we're going up.
Well, as I said, 6.3 of that million of that is related to specific budget change proposals. The majority of it deals with employee compensation changes, and my understanding is that's primarily because of the change in furlough. Remember, we were absorbing a 5% reduction, related to furloughs, and now that furloughs are no longer in place, we're no longer incorporated as part of our budget.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Any other questions of a general nature for Caltrans? Yeah, Ms. Butler.
Last year, you guys were looking at putting in a new office somewhere between like a very wide area, Glendale to Torrance, kind of a thing. Are you still looking at a new office?
Not to my knowledge. I think we're looking at the Palmdale Lancaster area, where we're going to be closing the Palmdale Lancaster offices and consolidating them into a single location. But I don't think our capital plan is proposing any additional office. We are currently locating an office in the Palm Desert area. That's our most recent addition.
Okay. Every time I go into the DMV still, it's crazy. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's enough offices, so. And I thought you had said you were expanding in that general area, but I guess not. Thank you.
Our emphasis is not to increase offices, but actually to hopefully drive more of our services so people don't have to come into an office.
Any additional questions? There's, under this issue on our agenda, there's a request that we adopt a couple of what are considered non-controversial budget change proposals. That would include the workforce cap, and as identified on page 14, the implementation of AB 1215, and on page 15, the budget change proposal in relation to the Operation Stone Garden grant, which is a cooperative agreement between Department of Homeland Security and the San Diego Sheriff's Office, and relates to the San Diego border, or the California border at San Diego. If these changes are acceptable, I'll take a motion to adopt those non-controversial BCPs. Ms. Butler moves. Mr. Huffman seconds. Roll call, please.
Gordon?
Aye.
Butler? Huffman?
Okay, thank you. We'll move to issue number 2, proposal regarding the DM fee registration fee. And I've asked Ellen Howe, who is my Assembly fellow, to join us up here. Ellen did the staff work on this item. So we'll have a fellow-to-fellow combat here. So you should probably have your fellow present. No, I'm kidding. So if you would make an initial presentation, then we'll ask if there's any comments from Finance and LAO.
The proposal is to provide a $5 discount for customers who pay their vehicle registration renewal through an alternative delivery channel. Alternative delivery channel would be a internet, mail, telephone, self-service terminal. Over the years, we've been focusing a lot of our efforts, primarily marketing all of these alternative delivery channels. And I think if you look at the growth in terms of customers who are using these, it has significantly increased over the last 5 years. There still is a significant portion of the population, though, that continues to come into the office to do these very simple transactions. And if you look at the cost of completing a vehicle registration in a field office, one of the simplest transactions that you can do, it costs us $14. To do that same transaction via the internet, you can do that for $7. What we think, by incentivizing this program, while we recognize this would be an incentive for all customers, it certainly would drive more of our customers to alternative means of getting the registration completed.
I'm Catherine Amon, Department of Finance. As the chart on page 17 shows, what we're really targeting is to try to break through the persistence of coming into the field office for that simple registration. As you can see, those transactions since 2007 through currently are running around 23 to 25% and have consistently run about that amount. So the question is, what innovative approach can we take to try to break through that behavior?
And I know the LAO has comments.
We do. Rashid Chavez from the Legislative Analyst Office. In general, we agree with the governor's approach to try to move customers outside of the field offices. However, in our view, a $5 discount to someone who's already doing the behavior that you want is not the correct economic incentive. Typically, what you'd like to do is to try to change behavior. So we kind of present you with an option that will possibly change behavior in the direction that you want to go. And we suggest we do some rough estimates and give you a $7 increase and a $2 decrease for someone who doesn't come in. And that $9 difference may be a target that you could get to. Our option also gives you the idea to preserve some motor vehicle account funding. So with the governor's presentation, what you'd have is $100 million off the table following if you went forward with this from the motor vehicle account. With what we kind of present, it's only 1.4 to 1.8 million off the table. And then that preserves some motor vehicle account, because you have to remember that you have the California Highway Patrol and the DMV that both access this account. CHP is about 1.9 billion on its own. If there were an emergency, you want to have enough money left over for economic reserve. So just keep those in mind.
And I'd note that the staff recommendation is that we hold this item open. I think you do present some interesting issues. Mr. Huffman?
I was just going to ask if the department might want to respond to that. I like the creative thinking that's going on here, but I think the LAO correctly points out that you're going to have free riders that are already doing this, and we can't really afford to hand money to people that are already doing this. And so, you know, there's got to be a creative way to figure this out. Do we have, and the other question I have is, do we have the ability to raise the fee for folks who come into the office, have a discount for folks that are online, and if it's revenue neutral, do that on a majority vote? Or do we?
Yeah. I don't know if you could do that on a majority vote, but I would.
I guess that's a question for the LAO or for, but anyway.
Let me comment on the LAO's proposal. You know, while it doing a discount in and of itself is a challenge, okay, regardless of whether we propose a penalty or a discount, it's going to be a challenge for the department. Currently, we're required to mail notices to customers 60 days prior to their due date. So in order to achieve our plan, we would have to begin mailing notices for October in July. Mm-hmm. So regardless of what the legislature chooses to do, we would have to be in a position to accommodate that by July 1. So any programming that this would require, we have to begin today. It takes us 60 days to do the programming to achieve these changes. And doing one change.
60 days
yes.
to do the?
Yes.
Wow. This is one of those only in government kind of.
Well, it just so happens that as we make vehicle registration more complicated, it takes longer to deal with the various circumstances that go into a vehicle registration. And what are, what variations of a vehicle registration? Do you have a smog check? What are the other fees that you might have to pay associated with, your location, things of that nature that go into a vehicle registration?
But this is simply a function of whether you pay for it in the office or online or through another channel, isn't it? No?
Well, it is.
I mean, that's a pretty simple change, and just putting a little different dollar figure next to those two.
I wish I could say it is, but it isn't.
LAO?
If I may, what takes so long for them to initiate it is in statute, the department has to notify us of our vehicle registration 90 days in advance, and that's just statutory in law. So that's what gets us to that lag that Mr. Valverde's were speaking to, and it's just something that's in statute. In regards to your question about the 2/3 vote,
but even that's just the content of the notice that we're talking about.
That's
and it
just
doesn't
the
take
content.
60 days to change the wording in the notice that goes out, so that you know that if you register a certain way, you pay X amount, and if you register a different way, you pay Y amount. That takes about an hour. Somebody on a typewriter, on a computer, just changing the text. I mean, I don't accept this 90-day, 60-day, can't get there from here, sort of thing here. And let's be a little more can-do about this. It's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. We can do this.
Can you comment on the 2/3 vote?
I can. In regards to the two-thirds vote, we did some research on it, and you guys could pass it without a two-thirds vote simply because the vehicle registration is strictly a fee. And there's a way to caveat the language. You could do it in trailer bill language or budget bill language that is just a strict fee because it is for your one-to-one for vehicle licenses. So you could do it that way.
The other question I have is that these funds go into the motor vehicle account, and you said earlier that that Highway Patrol takes some money out of that as well as DMV. Are we funding anything else out of that account?
There's a small portion of the Air Resources Board. I want to say off the head about 4% of that. They get about 4% of the motor vehicle account. The largest two are DMV and CHP.
Okay. I guess one of the other considerations for me is to make sure that as we vet this proposal, right, we're clear that we're not, if we're making these reductions, we're not impacting folks we don't want to impact.
Right.
Okay.
One other thought I had is you could even create a one-time incentive for first-time users of the online system or something like that, so you're not hitting free riders that are already doing it. There's just any number of ways to do it. I appreciate the LAO urging more creativity and precision in how this is done, and I think there's got to be a way to get there. So I'm hoping we see something that can be developed pretty quickly. I really like the idea of creating an incentive to get folks out of the offices for this transaction. There's no reason in the year 2012 people need to schlep into the DMV to do a lot of these. So I applaud the general direction and just hope we can figure out the right way to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Staff recommendation is that we hold this open, and I think that's an appropriate thing. I like the concept of incentive. Well, let's find a way to do this. And I do think that, again, that as the LAO points out, really not necessary to incent people already doing it. We need to get the folks who aren't to change behavior, and we need to take a look at how best to do that, I think. So I neglected to ask if there was any public comment on this issue. If not, I think we will leave this open and ask folks to continue to work on this. And we'll move to the final item on our agenda today. This is related to the technology infrastructure process improvement proposals. There are a set of budget change proposals that are highlighted here. I'll ask if there's any general presentation on this and look for finance and LAO comment.
Our centralized customer flow management and appointment system is an existing system that we use to manage the flow of customers in our field office. Our current system has reached its useful, end of life point, and currently we're experiencing, many, times when it's down. So this is just a replacement of that existing system, and hopefully will create, an upgraded process for us to maintain our customer flow process.
There are also a set of infrastructure-related projects. I don't know that it's necessary. They're fairly well described there, I think. Any comment from finance?
No, we support the information technology projects as the continuation of making DMV more efficient.
Okay. And LAO?
We also support the implementation of the IT projects. We think this is the direction you want to go if you really want to get to that customer service efficiency, and we recommend that you approve them.
Okay. Any public comment? The staff recommendation is that we adopt the budget change proposals related to the technology program, the infrastructure, and process improvement. If there's no further discussion or comment, a motion to adopt the language as suggested by staff would be appropriate. I have a motion and a second. A roll call, please.
Gordon?
Aye.
Butler? Hoffman?
That motion passes. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. And that concludes the business of the Budget Subcommittee number 3 for today. We will be convening again next week on Wednesday, March 28th at 9 a.m. in the morning. We'll be dealing at that point with some issues in the resource area of our responsibility. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting.